All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a ton of content to cover today, so I don't want to waste any of this precious hour. But thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jessica Wingert, and I am the program lead of ClimateCAP based here at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. And today we're going to be speaking with Alison Taylor about her experience and her new book, Higher Ground: How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. Before we get to that part of the conversation, I wanted to just take a minute or two to introduce ClimateCAP. We have a number of new faces registered for this event, so I wanted to give a quick highlight and context of some of the work that we're doing at ClimateCAP, and then we'll get right into our discussion. So for those of you who aren't familiar, ClimateCAP was really founded with the mission to prepare tomorrow's business leaders, which is a lot of those MBA students on the call today, to understand and respond to the climate challenge by mainstreaming that climate conversation in business schools. It was founded by us here at Fuqua, but we are a global partnership of 44 business schools, and we work really closely with the staff and faculty at those schools on a number of different initiatives, including the summit, the fellowship, and our MBA Academy virtual learning series, which you're here for today. And if you haven't yet signed up for our mailing list, please make sure that you do so you can stay up to date on these events. I'm just going to highlight a few of these really quickly. But before I do that, I want to highlight some of our partner schools. I mentioned we had 44 partner schools, and I wanted to bring attention to some of those schools who are supporting ClimateCAP at the leading and supporting partner level. You can see the full list of all of the schools that are involved in our initiative on our website, but wanted to thank these leading and supporting partners for making this program and a lot of our other initiatives possible. And for those of you who are prospective MBAs, you can check out links directly to all of these different schools from our website. Hopefully you've heard of the ClimateCAP Summit, but if you haven't, this is really our flagship event every year, bringing together hundreds of MBA students from around the country to network and learn about climate and business. We just recently had our 2024 summit in February at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, where we had over 400 MBAs from 39 universities attend. And we're already, if you can believe it, planning our next summit for late February next year at Berkeley Haas School of Business. There's some incredible conversations that have been had at this event in the past, and all of those recordings are available on our website. And for those of you who are still be students next year, please consider joining us at Haas. And next, I wanted to highlight the ClimateCAP MBA Fellowship, which empowers our 12 fellows every year to become the next generation of climate leaders and change makers. Different parts of this fellowship include learning and development sessions, networking, and a self-directed climate action project, where the students actually design and implement the project over the course of the 12 months. They receive mentorship and also attend different cohort building activities. And right now on the screen, you can see our 2024 ClimateCAP cohort, and our 2023 is available on our website as well. For those of you who will be students next year, our applications for the 2025 cohort will open up in fall, probably in the late September timeframe. And you can find a lot more information on our website. And today I wanted to highlight a really special upcoming session that we're having on May 16th. In this virtual learning session, prospective and incoming MBA students are invited to hear from business educators about the ways to integrate climate expertise during your MBA experience and prepare yourself to be a business career and a business leader that contributes to climate solutions. You'll also have the opportunity to network directly with representatives from some of our MBA programs in the ClimateCAP network. So please feel free to share this with any friends who are prospective or incoming MBA students. You can see the little registration link at the bottom. And it's also on the homepage of our website, climatecap.org, if you need to reach that as well. And lastly, I wanted to highlight the reason we're all here today, our MBA Academy virtual learning series. We bring this to you monthly during the academic year, and we're really excited to bring these thought leaders directly to you. So please check out our website. You can see recordings of all of our past conversations, as well as registration for a future event. And just to highlight, our last for the year is going to be coming up on May 1st, the role of the CFO in accelerating sustainable business, with Harmit Singh, who's the CFO of Levi Strauss, in conversation with Brad Sparks from Accounting for Sustainability. We're excited for that one too. And now to the reason we're all here today. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Alison Taylor. During our session, please feel free to use the QA function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions that you have. I'll be asking Alison questions at the beginning, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end to answer any questions that you might have. Alison Taylor is a clinical associate professor at NYU Stern School of Business and the executive director at Ethical Systems. Her previous work experience includes being a managing director at a nonprofit business network, PSR, and a senior managing director at Control Risks. She holds advisory roles at Ventures ESG, Sustainability Nonprofit BSR, Pictet Group, and KKR, and is a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Good Governance. She has expertise in strategy, sustainability, political and social risk, culture and behavior, human rights, ethics, compliance, stakeholder engagement, anti-corruption, and professional responsibility. And we'll be touching on a lot of those topics here today. Her new book, Higher Ground, How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World, was recently published by Harvard Business Review Press back in February of this year. Alison received her Bachelor of Arts in Modern History from Balliol College, Oxford University, her MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago, and MA in Organizational Psychology from Columbia University. With that, welcome, Alison.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, I want to get right into it. Since we've introduced you, I want to start with a question kind of to lay the groundwork for our audience today, and starting with a quote from your book that really just struck me and really resonated with me. So you say, companies are expected to balance conflicting stakeholder interests and demands, to follow clear global principles while adapting to local conditions and cultures, to solve societal problems while maintaining shareholder value, and to be transparent and authentic with no empty talk or inconsistencies. How did we get here?
I mean, what a good question, right? So I think maybe let's start with a really obvious point, which all MBA students spend a lot of time hearing about Milton Friedman and the Milton Friedman view of the world. But back in the 20th century, we collectively landed on the idea that what it takes to be an ethical business is you focus on shareholder value and you don't break the law. And that consensus held for quite a long time. And then really, I think, decisively started to break down after 2000. And then in the last decade has really collapsed. And so now we're in this era that many people call stakeholder capitalism. But the first point I'd make is that it's not as if the old Milton Friedman shareholder value pressures have gone away. So now it's sort of an everything, everywhere, all at once problem, where we've got this new rhetoric and these new frameworks, but the old pressures are just as intense as ever. And then the other thing I think we can say about the world today is that partly because of how polarized and dysfunctional the US is, I think if you're running a company, it feels like there's a chorus of voices from the right saying, forget all this woke nonsense, forget climate change, your fiduciary duty is go back to Milton Friedman, go back to basics, just ignore all this stuff. And really, good luck hiring or retaining anyone under 30 if you're going to take that position. But then I think on the other side of the spectrum, and I hear a lot of this coming from really pro-sustainability people, you sort of get the impression that nothing a company can ever do will be good enough. I use the example of Patagonia in my book, which most people think of as a poster child for sustainability. As we know, the founder handed over ownership of Patagonia to a charity, which is about the most radical stakeholder focused thing that you can dream of. And at least on my social media feeds, it took about 5 hours before people started being like, well, the business model is still based on plastic and they're not giving employees a stake and this is just tax avoidance. And so I think we need to be clear that from this perspective, that if any of your stakeholders care about this thing, you ought to be doing something about it. There is nothing you can do to address these critiques. There's nothing you can do that will go far enough to satisfy all the critics. And so we've really, I think, kind of got ourselves in a mess. We're presenting two completely unachievable visions. And then it really seems that trying to take a nuanced middle ground annoys people more than anything else. So for that reason, I start off arguing in the book that it's never been so difficult to run a business as it is today.
Yeah, I think that would probably resonate with a lot of people who are especially coming from the corporate world and have corporate experience and just the challenges. You can see that. So I want to dig in a little bit more to something you mentioned around like kind of the politicization of the corporate world. CEOs are sometimes choosing to become activists, which therefore makes their organizations theoretically these agents for change. So where does that make sense for a CEO to engage on a social or environmental issue? And when does that not make sense?
Right. So this is a another kind of fascinating development, and it's maybe another answer to the question of how we got here. And so one of the things we can see is that corporate America between around 2013 and now has become dramatically more willing to take stands, to take positions on controversial social, political, environmental topics. I think the first thing to say is that this is relatively new. Before around 2013, we had this idea, everyone accepted, business needs to be politically neutral. It is not a good idea for business to alienate some part of its customer base. That makes perfect sense, right? If you're Walmart, why would you take a stand that alienates half of America and might kind of put off your customers? And so we had this idea, business is politically neutral. There's a famous joke from Michael Jordan in the 90s, Republicans buy sneakers too. And business was like, not getting involved. Of course, beneath the surface, companies are spending across the political spectrum, so they've got friends on both sides. But that was, for a very long time, that was what we accepted that business shouldn't be doing. After about 2013, this starts to break down. The example I use in the book is we can take two very similar incidents and we can look at dramatically different corporate responses. So a teenager, Michael Brown, is murdered by the police in Ferguson in 2014. That starts the first Black Lives Matter protests. At that time, corporate America does not want to get involved in such a divisive and distressing issue. But just 7 years later, of course, we can think of the CEO reactions to George Floyd being murdered and see that something has happened during this time. So clearly the Trump administration is a catalyst here. He comes into power. There's already a lot of social turmoil growing because of social media. And I think it seems to CEOs then a good idea. Trump pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So CEOs are like, we are still in. We're going to support climate action. Mm-hmm. Trump takes divisive positions on immigration. Business stands up for immigration. And so, we start to see this rhetoric emerge of CEOs are the new politicians, CEOs are the new societal leaders. We can't really trust politics to deal with anything. So we've turned to business basically because there's nowhere else to go. And I think this rhetoric really encouraged businesses and business leaders into saying, we will take positions, we'll solve intractable societal problems. It is our job to do this. This is our job to be moral leaders. And at the same time, we see all this kind of idea that this is a win-win. Doing the right thing for stakeholders is a win-win. We start to see Larry Fink saying you've got to have a social purpose for business. We see the Business Roundtable saying business needs to balance the interests of all stakeholders. So I don't think it's a big mystery why business leaders get drawn into this very fashionable rhetoric in around 2018, 2019. But then, of course, things start to get a little bit more tricky because once you're a corporate leader and you've said you've got values beyond shareholder value, you're then facing this chorus of voices that would like you to take stands and take positions, and a chorus of voices, I think, increasingly that are viewing the corporate world as the outlet for what used to be political frustrations. So something I hear in the classroom very often is, I could stand in line and vote. It's a gerrymandered system. What good will it do? Or I can pressure a brand. I can pressure a company. I can pressure my employer to do something about an issue I care about. And they're much more likely to respond, and it's much more likely to be effective. So all of this is a long-winded way of saying we've encouraged companies to take stands and use their rhetoric and to start to tell stories about how they can satisfy interests of all stakeholders. Since then, of course, we've had Putin invading Ukraine. We've had the end of Roe versus Wade. Now we've got the Middle East conflict, and we've got the ESG backlash. So I think it's become clear now to corporate leaders that if you do this, if you start to take stands, you're opening up this can of worms about the limit and remit of your responsibility. So you asked when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense to take these public positions. Mm-hmm. I think the first thing to say is if it's got something directly relevant to your business or to your people or how your business makes money, it may be appropriate for you to speak up and say something. But you should never do this if you have not got your ducks in a row internally. So don't go out there and make a lot of noise about racism if you have not thought about your internal DEI commitments. Don't go out there and make a lot of noise about your net zero commitments and caring about climate change if your government relations team is lobbying in completely a different direction and you do not have your ducks in a row in terms of your internal climate strategy. And so I think, I think the first thing to say is that businesses need to be a lot more realistic and a lot more honest and a lot more focused about the kind of problems that they can take on and the promises that they make to society and to stakeholders.
So let's say that a company or a leader decides to start going down this with either a social or environmental challenge that they want to pursue. How there's really a lack of consensus on how far you take that. So not only should I, but now that I'm here, where do I go? So how do you recommend that companies kind of think through the question of how far to go down this path?
Well, I think we need to say up front, Jessica, and I honestly find it bizarre how little this is discussed out there. We need to say up front, there is no consensus on how far business should go to solve intractable societal problems. Ethics and compliance talks as if it is the job of the company to keep the regulator happy and deflect the regulator. ESG doesn't really consider the role of other institutions in society at all. It says there are these range of non-financial, environmental, social governance issues a company could pay attention to, and the company should select those issues on the basis that they in some way correlate to financial returns, almost as if the government doesn't exist and civil society doesn't exist. And then we've got, this sort of question of what it means to operate responsibly in a different environment. So we've now got all these pressures, for example, saying that companies should take on responsibility for emissions or human rights violations in their supply chains. So, but then, of course, that starts to open up a can of worms really, really quickly. If we think, for example, about the cocoa industry, which has been operating in West Africa and sourcing cocoa for many decades, has been facing concerns about child labor and human rights violations and deforestation in West Africa for many, many decades. Part of the problem I think that they're running into is, if there's child labor on your farms or if there's deforestation taking place, is it then your job to start to provide education for those children? Is it your job to make it better for those cocoa farmers so they don't need to worry about this? Or are you then replacing the education system in West Africa? What's your relationship with the government? How are you undermining public policy? What is your responsibility as a corporation to solve education problems in West Africa? How far do you need to go? And so one of the things I think that's very interesting about the rise of ESG and the kind of current discourse is we've forgotten about all these very tricky, intractable problems. And even if we think about something like Scope 3 emissions, right, which say a big multinational should take on responsibility for its entire value chain, we're not really clear about how that's supposed to happen, what a company must do to compensate for leverage. And a lot of this, I think, is playing out in terms of big multinationals putting pressure on their smaller suppliers to put in place various initiatives and maybe not being prepared to pay the money or take the time to make those procurement processes better or to empower those suppliers so they've actually got the budget and wherewithal to do that. So I feel we've got very, very confused about the limits and the remit of corporate responsibility.
Sure. And with all of these different issues, like you said, intractable issues that are coming at the different companies, it's a challenge because a company can't meaningfully measure and manage all of the different aspects of ESG. So, what are your thoughts on recommendations on how companies should be prioritizing where they're spending their efforts?
So, I mean, I think one of the things I would say is you need to actually take materiality seriously. A lot of materiality assessments out there are just ticking the box on 40 things. They're trying to get a better ESG score. They're disclosing to make investors happy. They're not treating environmental and social issues as a true strategic priority. If something's a strategic priority, then you're saying we're going to focus here. We're going to focus on 1 to 3 issues. We might report on everything else, but this is not a disclosure exercise. This is a strategic change exercise. So I think the one thing companies should do is be much more courageous about saying, here's where we're going to focus, and therefore we're going to mean that we're going to have capital allocation, we're going to have our incentives, we're going to have our performance measured across this stuff. We're really going to bake this into core corporate strategy. And I think what you actually see is many companies treating environmental and social issues as either a marketing exercise or a compliance exercise. So that will do something, right? Having clear, focused material priorities that are in the top right of your materiality assessment. I think, though, you also need to pay attention to your impacts on society and your negative externalities. And there in the book, I argue that human rights frameworks are a much better guide than ESG frameworks to figuring out what the limit and remits of your responsibility actually is.
Sure. You mentioned the need for the strategic focus. So I'm curious if you have any examples maybe that you can give. You know, once the company has identified an issue of focus from that materiality, how do they go about embedding those priorities into their strategy? Do you have any examples of where that's been done well or poorly?
I mean, I think in general, this is being done incredibly poorly. I wrote an article with Bob Eccles last summer called The Evolving Role of Chief Sustainability Officers, where we argue that, you know, if sustainability is being taken seriously, you would see a strategic focus. You would see the issue being involved in capital allocation decisions. You'd see the Chief Sustainability Officer being a member of the C-suite with budget and power and resources. You would see clarity from the company about whether the ESG issue in question presents a risk or an innovation opportunity or is a negative externality requiring ethical guardrails. You tend not to see any of that stuff. You see a lot of glossy reports with a lot of columns and laundry lists of issues and happy pictures of smiling children in developing countries and look at all the wonderful things we're doing and ticking the box and, you know, let's listen to our stakeholders and that kind of thing. It's relatively rare to see a company have a clear strategic focus. We can think about some examples. However, Chobani, the yogurt company, focuses on the US agricultural food system. GM has done a good job, you know, focusing on climate change as the core of its future strategy. A company like Ørsted obviously is at the forefront of the energy transition. So there are companies that are being much more focused and bold. I also have recently heard from Unilever that they've said we had too many broad, long-term vague targets. We're going to be more focused on these 4 issues, including plastics. We're going to have clear goals, clear business metrics. And so I do think we're starting to see the mood shift, but there's been a lack of seriousness and really a tendency to treat sustainability as sort of stealth PR or compliance. That has got to change if we're going to actually do something about these challenges.
Absolutely. And going back to the materiality piece, you know, so a company's done their materiality assessment. They've prioritized those 1 to 3 issues you mentioned. Many organizations are still putting a lot of pressure on those companies to report. So you've got the governmental requirements like the EU CSRD, non-governmental reporting frameworks like CDP. They all want their own version of this information. So how should business leaders be thinking through the management of all of that external noise about where they should be reporting and focusing and sticking to their priorities that they've identified?
Yeah, I find this worrying from a few points of view. I think the maturation, isn't that even a word? The increasing maturity of reporting frameworks, increasing consistency is generally good news. I do not think it should suck up 95% of the debate and conversation in the way it does. Interesting, useful. It is not the entire conversation. We put way too much faith on the power of disclosure to drive change, and way too much faith on these disclosures and these reporting, even as a tool that's valuable for investors. Even with the best disclosure in the world, even looking, if you were to directly compare Pepsi and Coca-Cola's water use, that's still of limited interest because the companies have completely different business models and completely different product portfolios. So I think we're telling ourselves a story if we think any investor can do apples to apples comparison and make useful decisions on the basis of this disclosure. So good news to a point, does not deserve 90% of the discourse. I think also we are doing a good job turning what used to be a marketing exercise into a compliance exercise. So what I'm now hearing is it's become harder to be focused. It's becoming harder to say these are our priorities and these are the things we're not going to deal with, because now there's this concern that if you're not reporting to this thing and you're not checking this box, somebody is going to kind of come and sue you. So something can be a compliance disclosure regime without that necessarily diluting corporate strategy. But I worry that people that are not deep enough in this space sort of see reporting as an end in itself, see reporting as the whole landscape, and don't understand that companies tend to respond to reporting pressures in a certain way by putting out very curated disclosures. And again, I'm sort of surprised people are surprised by this. If we're going to say to companies, investors need to see all these ESG disclosures and they're going to score you and rate you and allocate capital on that basis, are we surprised that what we see is a lot of curated spin? What would you do if you were a company? Yeah, I think I worry that even though this reporting and maturity of frameworks might seem to be good news, I keep going on panels where people are like, ha ha ha, the alphabet soup, and then they argue about the alphabet soup for 40 minutes, and I sit and I wonder what people in the audience that are not neck deep in this stuff make of this, and I don't know why we're making this so sort of depressing and tick box and jargon heavy, rather than seeing this as a real opportunity to transform our economy and transform our businesses.
Absolutely. Coming from my corporate sustainability experience, we spent so much time just trying to think through all of the different reporting frameworks and where it made sense for us to spend our time and efforts in data collection. And that frankly took away from some of the time we could have been doing projects and getting things done. And so I think it's a really interesting.
And I hear from so many sustainability officers, there are so many questionnaires. We're expected to fill out all these questionnaires. It's perceived to be incredibly risky to stop answering these questionnaires. And very often there are no consequences if you stop reporting along any of these frameworks. I don't think again, this deserves to take up the time and attention that it actually is doing. And I worry that we are confusing leaders and confusing people who need to understand the real imperative here.
Well, and then there's the risk in line with my next question here. Sharing information can be really impactful, can be really powerful, but it can also be weaponized against you. So what does good transparency look like? Maybe if you have examples specifically around the climate space, but what is good transparency here that's not going to be used against you?
So the CDP has just done an analysis and looked at 4,100 companies' net zero commitments and found that 89 of them were credible. So clearly we've got a problem. We've got a tendency to set a long-term goal out there and hope that everybody is going to be convinced by it. I also think there's, as a result of all these disclosure pressures, there's a sense that if you admit to imperfection, if you admit to something being challenging, if you admit that something is difficult, then that's going to be incredibly risky for you and destroy your reputation. But you probably see in the classroom, as I do, there's now so much skepticism and so much eye rolling and so much lack of belief of what companies are saying, saying that actually these very neat, curated, sewn up disclosures, I think, have the impact of seeming less credible than admitting that something is hard and admitting to imperfection, and has the impact, I think, of making everything seem like greenwashing. It sort of seems like everyone's using the same rhetoric and everyone's using the same language, and so you can't tell a good from a bad job. In my book, I use the example of Microsoft being very, very clear. It had missed its climate targets and what it was going to do about them. I also really love the example of Atlassian, the Australian tech company. If you were to download and read their sustainability report right now and download the first page, you would see really clear jargon-free language. Here's what we achieved last year. Here's where we failed. Here's why we failed. Here's what we're going to do something about. Here's what we're going to do something about next. And the impact of that disclosure on the reader, I think, is that you trust Atlassian. If they say they've done something, you believe them, because if they say they failed or they say something is challenging, you're getting a clear view of why that is. They've just written a wonderful guide called on how to get to net zero, but it's really wonderful and it's really clear and it speaks directly to that public policy challenge, to that challenge of needing all businesses to make change, to the challenge that we don't necessarily have a clear path forward on some of these technologies. And to me, that is a much better conversation than the kind of PR heavy overpromising we tend to see.
Sure, sure. I want to shift focus now towards stakeholders, because I know that's something that everyone's always talking about: stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement. It's something that's talked about constantly, but is very hard to achieve. What are some of the best practices that you recommend for the companies that you work with as far as identifying and defining who their stakeholders really are?
Yeah, so one of the things I think, just to say up front, is that a lot of the kind of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder capitalism rhetoric, it's too generic to be meaningful. If you're really, as a company, going to try and map and consider the interests of your stakeholders, we're quickly talking about thousands, maybe millions of entities. It quickly becomes a kind of incoherent, generic exercise. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that companies get expertise in dealing with particular stakeholder groups because there's friction. Companies do not develop expertise in a vacuum. So what that means is that very often, if a particular sector has a bad reputation or is facing a lot of pressure in terms of their dealing with a particular stakeholder group, then that might be a sign that that particular sector or company is more advanced than other companies in dealing with that issue. So let me give you a few examples. You will read enormous amounts of negative media and negative publicity about the efforts of food and apparel companies on their supply chain oversight. We've mentioned cocoa in West Africa already. We can all think about the negative reporting on fast fashion, for example. And so you would get, I think, as a casual observer, the impression from this reporting that food and apparel companies are doing a worse job on supply chain oversight than anyone else. But in fact, they're doing a better job on supply chain oversight, at least some of them, than anyone else. And so looking at what food and apparel companies are doing on supply chain oversight and the kind of challenges they're facing gives us a much clearer view of the supply chain oversight landscape than looking, for example, at a mining company or a pharmaceutical company. Or we could think about mining and oil and gas firms who, because they have such a dramatic impact on the communities that live around their operations, have, huge teams of PhD anthropologists and sociologists dealing with community relations and community engagement. And so if you want to understand best practice on something like free, prior, informed consent or community consultation, you're going to find the deepest expertise in mining and oil and gas companies, the same companies that have the worst reputation for these practices. So I'm certainly not saying, that all mining and oil and gas companies are doing a great job on community relations. I'm saying that if you look at businesses that are forefront of a particular stakeholder challenge, you will see the problem much more clearly and see where we are in designing solutions much more clearly. And so our tendency to treat all this stuff as a case of sorting good companies from bad companies, our tendency to say you're either good at dealing with stakeholders or you aren't, is preventing us from seeing and learning from the specific practices that work and the specific things that companies are finding really, really intractable and where we haven't yet found good solutions.
Sure. I think it's such an interesting and complex issue, but I'm curious about something you started to allude to around this idea of kind of building credibility. So you talked about it specifically within the transparency, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more specifically within this idea of those stakeholders once they've been identified. How should business leaders be thinking about building stakeholder trust and building credibility with those groups?
So, yeah, right. So another really interesting kind of corner we've painted ourselves into on this topic is that we have equated reputational risk management and stakeholder trust. There's a survey called the Edelman Trust Barometer that is put out by a PR firm that claims to be measuring trust, and what it's really measuring is reputational risk. So let me be clear. If what you're saying is that the problem is reputational risk, what you're saying is the company or the company communications and sustainability teams need to tell stakeholders a certain story and deflect stakeholder perceptions to protect corporate value. So that is not a concept that considers we have a reciprocity with stakeholders, or we have some notion that we're impacted by them and they impact us. We do not have a notion that we need to treat stakeholders with dignity and respect, that we need to consider and build trust in a meaningful way. And so, I think we need to really kind of think about what is the difference between reputational risk management, which is a communication strategy, telling a certain story, putting out certain disclosures, hoping that keeps stakeholders satisfied, versus actually saying we need to govern with the interests of stakeholders in mind, which means asking them their opinion, and even more dramatically, maybe being prepared to change something based on what stakeholders tell us. So there's a lot of stakeholder engagement, and I'm putting it in inverted commas, that goes on for its own sake, where the company has no intention of doing anything differently. And my experience would be if a company, let's say an employee engagement survey, if I'm an employee and a company asks me what I think about things, and I then get the sense that they're using that to say, look at our great employee engagement scores, and they're not listening to me, and they're not going to change anything about the benefits and the promotion process and how they're running things based on what I say, I'm more annoyed than if they hadn't asked me in the first place. And I think we see that, again and again and again. I've done so much work with communities in the mining sector myself. And what you hear if you go and speak to those communities over and over again is all these people, all these consultants come through and they tramp through and they ask us all these questions and we do all these surveys and we ask for help, and then we never hear anything again. So we're doing all this. We seem to be treating this as a sort of exercise for its own sake, and not taking the step of saying, we care what these stakeholders think so we can make different decisions. We can address our blind spots. We can think about the things that we're missing. We can use insights to develop new products and services. We see a lot of blah, 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 and not a lot of actually real stuff happening. That's the problem.
Sure. I could go so many different ways, but I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So I'm going to ask two more questions here, and then anyone in the audience feel free to submit via the QA, and we'll get to those here shortly. But I have plenty more to go myself. I want to kind of end this section with a question around nobody gets everything right. No company, no CEO ever gets everything right. When they run into these issues, whether it's misaligned incentives or poor stakeholder management, any of the many pitfalls we discussed today, what do you recommend for them when they mess up? How do they start to rebuild that trust?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that once you have destroyed trust, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild it. There is a survey, not a survey, an academic article called Not All Sparks Light a Fire, that shows if you have a good reputation, if you have a strong basis of trust, you will be given the benefit of the doubt when a crisis starts. If you do not have that level of trust, it sort of seems like you're in a spiral and you keep digging and digging and digging. If we just think about Boeing or Wells Fargo as kind of examples, it seems they keep changing the leadership. They keep saying they've turned a corner, and they seem to make the same mistakes over and over again. So, so I think the first thing is to say that once you've messed up, once you've got a problem, once you've degraded culture, it takes radical change to dig out of that. So you need to be prepared to fire a lot of people in senior leadership. You need to be prepared to change your structures and incentives and decision making. The CEO of Microsoft, I think, did this in the aftermath of the Bill Gates era. He has made dramatic changes to make decision making and culture very, very different in that firm. You need to think about how all the processes and systems fit together. You need to, admit that you have gone horrible, you've got things horribly wrong, and really, really kind of try to draw a line in the sand and say that some things, things are completely different. But I think, we need to be very, very clear that once you've gone in a certain direction, it is very, very, very hard to reverse course.
Thank you so much for all of that. My last question before we open up for audience questions is more advice, especially for our audience. Many of them are MBA students or young alumni, and they're thinking about where they might best fit in and make their impacts as they evaluate, post-graduation plans or that next job after school. Given the context of this complexity that we've been talking about today, what are some of the personal reflection questions that you recommend that they think through as they're trying to figure out where they might fit best?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a really obvious point is to consider what you actually enjoy in your work and to focus on that. Where sustainability specifically, I have two pieces of advice I tend to give. I think the way that sustainability is evolving means it may not make sense to want to work in the standalone function or think about this as a standalone area of expertise anymore. So one thing that might be sensible is to say, everybody who is doing an MBA in the 2020s needs to have a minor in sustainability. So you can continue to have deep expertise in product development or marketing or risk or financial performance or whatever it might be, but you need to have a conceptual understanding of sustainability and a sense of confidence with these issues, and to be able to factor in those issues to the core, your core expertise and how you do your job. So that's the first thing to say. I think then the second thing to say is that there's no such thing as a sustainability or ESG expert. Nobody has both breadth and depth. And so to focus on a particular technical area of expertise might be really sensible. And then to think about, if you're going to think about jobs, rather than trying to be in the sustainability function, think about what that company's most material issue is and go and work on that issue, which might mean the social impact of technology, might mean, the design of algorithms and content moderation if you're going to work in tech. It might mean going to work on climate change issues with oil and gas. It might mean going and working on supply chain oversight in a consumer products company. So rather than thinking about a generic sustainability professional skill set, I would focus on material issues. I would focus on having a depth in one area, and then I would focus on having a broad conceptual understanding of what sustainability actually is.
Thank you. And I'll say ClimateCAP is a great organization to help them get that broad experience in sustainability, no matter where they end up. Well, I'm going to ask a few questions here. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit based on some themes here I'm seeing, but going back to the point you made earlier around the pressure on companies, so kind of where we started this conversation. there's a lot of pressures for companies to be more transparent or ethical. Employees are a big driver for that. Consumers are a big driver for that. Can you maybe share some best practices on how employees can start to drive change from within, potentially how customers or consumers can start to drive change? You mentioned some of the social media impacts, but I'm curious if you have any other thoughts on different ways that can happen.
Yeah, there's a wonderful organization called Regeneration Canada, which has a toolkit for employee activists that I would encourage everybody to read. So that's the first thing to say. I think we've got into this era, and I hear it in the classroom, where we've got this idea that if we go and petition and yell at company leaders, they'll be more willing to take on responsibility for our pet issue. So I would encourage anyone trying to get a company leader to change, to think about the trade-offs and think about the focus and think about, before I start to push McDonald's to take a position on the Middle East conflict, to consider maybe whether it would be a better idea to have McDonald's focused on the climate impact of beef, for example. So I would encourage potential employee activists to, again, focus on those material issues and be realistic about what is in the company's remit and the problem that the company can take on. Once you've got through all of that, then I guess where I really land is that the most appropriate and impactful place for any employee to focus is the company's political spending and influence. So rather than the company making a lot of noise about all the problems it claims to solve over there while the government relations team is still spending in completely different direction, focus on political transparency, focus on getting the company to be involved responsibly in how it is engaging with policy, how it is engaging with decision makers, how it's engaging with trade associations, how it's engaging with campaign finance. Because quite honestly, and I see a question in the chat about, doesn't business run politics? Yes, it does, and that's kind of the problem. Is that the influence of business on the political process is stopping us solving many of these problems at the political level. So I think a really appropriate place for all employee activists to focus is on that political spending and transparency, and making sure that companies have got their ducks in a row and are being aligned with what they say their sustainability commitments are over here and what they're actually doing in other parts of the business over there.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from a self-identified semi-jaded sustainability consultant. And that is, what is your view on whether or how companies should approach the idea of degrowth and growth in this efficiency economy, especially in the context of overconsumption as a key element of the hurdle to achieve long-term net zero goals?
Oh my gosh, what a question. I think we need to be very, very careful with how ideas and concepts in this space are likely to become weaponized. There is already a chorus of voices out there saying that ESG is stealth socialism, ESG is, driving a very particular agenda that certain actors are not going to be able to achieve, in the ballot box, etc. So I think, I think we need to be very, very, very careful about this political rhetoric and where to take it. And I do not, I do think that there are, questions about growth and economic expansion over the long term. But I would rather see kind of focus and honesty about what problems business can and can't take on than a dramatic shift to this rhetoric. I understand where it's coming from, but looking in particular at how things are playing out in the US, I worry about the second order consequences here.
Thank you. I have one more. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. But this question is kind of around industry collaboration, this idea of pre-competitive collaboration. everyone's facing these same challenges, right? Everyone within an industry is getting similar pressures from their suppliers, from their customers. So do you have any examples or thoughts on this idea of pre-competitive collaboration and how that can kind of help shift the industry, I think either positive or negatively, to increase transparency or kind of just streamline a little bit all of this noise that we're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, there are enormous numbers of industry collaborations out there. So, we can certainly see that we can think of all of us, I'm sure, off the top of our heads, of numerous problems companies can't solve alone, numerous reasons for companies to get together with other actors in the industry to either drive common standards for suppliers or take collective action on an intractable issue or just speak with one voice. So conceptually, it's totally fine. I think we all also know that in reality, a lot of this stuff is window dressing. A lot of these coalitions are zombie coalitions. They suck up enormous amounts of time and energy. There's a tendency to kind of sign on to all these standards. And you'd asked about the consumer earlier. A lot of this kind of plays out with all these certifications. They're absolutely overwhelming. You end up in the aisle of the supermarket trying to figure out what kind of coffee to buy and which one of these particular exercises means anything. So yes, I think it is appropriate to be involved in industry collaborations and to really think about what to join and how to drive impact. I would encourage everybody to be extremely selective about these. And then also, again, this is an area where Republicans are really driving pressure on antitrust. So needing to be very, very, very clear here about what the efforts do and don't involve. And again, not sleepwalking into giving certain elements of society the kind of rhetoric and the kind of hook they need to say that this is all a bad faith exercise.
Well, thank you so much. With that, I'm gonna wrap this up. Thank you so much, Alison, for that incredible conversation and sharing your expertise with our MBA audience. I just really enjoyed that, and I know everyone else did as well. I also would like to thank our attendees for joining us. As a reminder, there's a lot of different ways that you can get involved with ClimateCAP. So please make sure you're signed up for our newsletter. You'll know when the recording of this session is available, so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. And you can sign up for either of these upcoming events like our next MBA Academy or that integrating climate into your MBA session that I mentioned earlier on our website. Thank you again. We're really glad to have this program and to be able to connect with you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And again, thank you, Alison.
Have a great weekend, everybody.